She had never lied about her smile until the night it saved her life. It was a smile that folded like something precise and dangerous, a practiced arc she had used since childhood to close the gaps people left when they passed by. For years, Iris Marlowe had kept her face calibrated for comfort, a small list of safe expressions that eased errands, smoothed conversations, let other people's storms pass without asking for shelter. That night, a knock at the door, and the way the hallway light cut the pattern of a stranger's jaw made everything she had hidden feel suddenly porous, as if the smile might spill the truth she had learned to hold beneath her ribs. Iris worked as an intake counselor at a low-lit clinic that sat on a street where the city pretended to sleep. Her job was to read cracks in speech, to play soft words where panic wanted to scream. She had chosen a profession that rewarded carefulness and taught her to practice empathy like a craft. Her flaw, a hesitation that stretched like thread through decisions, had never been more dangerous. She hesitated before she trusted, hesitated before she moved, and in that slowness she had let opportunities to stop bad things slip like water through cupped hands. The last month had been a pattern of small disturbances, a photograph left tucked into her coat pocket that she did not remember putting there, a voicemail that ended in static, and then the sound of someone humming the melody her mother used to whistle as a child. She kept these things at the back of drawers until one evening the world narrowed to this single bright point of the visitor's knock. When she opened the door, there was no shadow of a man or woman, only a plain note taped to the wood. It read 3 words that your stomach recognizes before your eyes can finish. I know you. Her first instinct was to flip the note over for signs, a name, a smear of ink. There was nothing. Just the paper, the threat held in 3 small black letters. Her training told her to call, to log the incident, to file it out of the hall of her days like a report. Her heart, which had learned to catalog fear into clinical case numbers, did not do that. It remembered the small betrayals of her childhood, the times men had smiled and then used the kindness of her voice against her. Iris decided to follow the pattern in the note rather than the steps that would make a neat file in an intake drawer. She started watching beyond the comfortable edge of work hours, learning the cadence of the building across the street, the neighbor who watered plants at midnight, the way the postal worker's laugh stopped at a certain stoop. Her hesitation became an asset because it taught her patience and the power of waiting. Waiting let her see the small things others missed at a glance. On a Sunday morning, she found a second note tucked behind the loose shutter on the clinic's back window. This one had a time and a place and a name she almost didn't recognize, spelled wrong in a way that read like someone testing a key on a piano and missing a string. The notes grew from threat to instruction, which meant they were not random. Someone wanted to shape her life like clay. She told herself she would involve the police. She typed out a report and left it in the unsympathetic server of caution and red tape. She told herself she would not be a story in the paper or a cautionary tale told over coffee. But she also began the very unscientific work of assembling a map of small signs, a smear of lipstick on a cup that wasn't hers, a phone call she could not trace with a humming in the background. a neighbor's dog that would not stop staring at a window the way a person does when they watch a stage play. She made lists she did not show anyone. She learned to hide the hole her fear made in her chest by moving things from one shelf to another, creating work that looked incidental but was careful as surgery. Her life became a strange double existence. Iris, the counselor with measured speech and precise empathy, and Iris, the woman cataloging every aberration like a detective who could not afford to be wrong. That first shock, the smile that saved her life, finally settled into a purpose she could name: not to let the quiet cruelty of anonymous threats erode the boundary between her day and her night. She promised herself small, improbable campaigns of vigilance. Each promise was a brick she set down without telling anyone, because secrets felt safer if you held them alone. But secrets also sing to one another, and the moment she thought she had the pattern under control, the world presented a new thing she could not predict. Someone had been watching her count the bricks. Dawn came like a soft accusation, and Iris had the uneasy conviction that secrets wake hungrier than people do. She rose to the narrow window and watched the neighborhood clear its nightcoat. Birds that knew nothing of human threats landed on wires and pretended that morning had not happened. Iris told herself to breathe and to count things rationally. There were 3 notes now. A pattern, and patterns meant people who made choices. She collected evidence like a person collecting shells, small, ordinary things that together could make a judgment. At the clinic, she read files and learned the ways trauma inscribed itself on speech, the same cadence that allowed predators to mask intent with warmth. Her work was a textbook of human contradictions. Clients confessed to tiny cruelties and enormous regrets in equal measure. Her friend Anna, who taught night classes at the college and who believed secrets paled when spoken aloud, pressed her to go to the police again. "You can't carry this," Anna said, folding her hands like an argument. But Iris had an instinct that stretched past authority. Institutional systems move in gears that are too large when danger needs small, fast motions. So she chose a different course. She began to stake out the paths mentioned in the notes, learning which coffee shops emptied at noon and which alleys hid the cigarette butts of people who liked to watch. She learned to read indifference like a map. Along the way, she found a woman named Mara who worked nights at the laundromat. Mara had a laugh that cut through fog and a past that made her suspicious in the right places. Iris struck a friendship with Mara on the pretense of needing advice about a missing key. Mara asked questions that made Iris shrink, and then honest answers spilled out like pebbles. Together, they traced a delivery van that seemed to cross Iris's neighborhood at odd hours. It was a van with a business name that existed only on the internet and had a phone number that went to voicemail full of static. A pattern was emerging, and it pulled at the edges of Iris's careful life until the seam threatened to burst. She stopped sleeping through nights. Dreams rearranged themselves into instruction manuals she did not ask for: how to move quietly in an apartment, how to check a window without being obvious, how to plant a false trail. Mara taught her to tell sharper stories when necessary, to play stakes by voice and not let pity dilute them. Iris practiced in front of the clinic mirror until she could report things without the tremor that once softened facts. One evening, Mara came to Iris with a small key found in a neighborhood garden that had an engraving Iris recognized from a childhood trinket long lost. It was a stupid physical connection, but such things matter. The invisible thread that tied two moments together. Iris realized that the person composing the notes knew how to move in the language of intimacy, leaving breadcrumbs that felt personal and thus more capable of eroding confidence. The target was not random. It was personalized, perhaps based on a memory, perhaps on a file, perhaps on the fact that Iris's empathy made her accessible. She could have walked into a police station and asked for protection and official paperwork and a sense of formal safety. Instead, she mapped, she waited, and in the waiting her mind sharpened. In the space between two notes, she discovered a new version of herself, someone who could balance warmth and suspicion, who could hold the clinic's compassion and a private plan like two stones, one in each hand. She rehearsed confrontations in which she would not be gaslit, where she would name things with order and drive them into the light. Her hesitation remained. It was woven into who she was, but she had learned to set boundaries around it and to use that same slow patience to notice missteps in others. The van returned, and Iris waited with her breath measured like a metronome, Maria at her side, and the city sliding by like a giant indifferent clock. The map they drew with coffee stains and tired pens turned into a new kind of evidence. Small, repeatable movements that made a pattern when placed upon each other like transparent sheets. Iris and Mara started noting days and times, the alignment of deliveries, and the way certain faces watched the clinic door as if waiting for a cue. Patterns are most dangerous when they look ordinary. Iris noticed how predators prefer ordinariness because the human eye is trained to ignore what appears routine. She also noticed her own complicity, the time she dismissed an unease because she did not want to be the one to create trouble. That softness had to be replaced. They rented a cheap motion camera and installed it behind the clinic's back window, a device Iris had once suggested to a terrified mother whose child had gone missing. The camera caught the van twice that week, and the footage showed only the back doors opening for a minute and then closing again, a human silhouette bending inside. The silhouette's movements were careful, domestic, nothing dramatic that would prompt an immediate arrest. But when Iris blew up the footage on a laptop screen, the curve of a shoulder, the way hands paused over a box, the tilt of the head felt intimately familiar, like the memory of a laugh you could almost recall after someone says the name. Iris's life narrowed to the image of that shoulder. She began to comb through the clinic's appointment logs, the sign-in sheets, looking for names that overlapped with deliveries, people who mentioned particular patterns she had learned to associate with grooming or stalking. Her mind was a sieve ferreting for coincidence. One night she found an entry in a volunteer ledger, a short name, an initial, a date that matched the first note. A volunteer who had helped at the clinic months ago, someone who had memorably asked too many intimate questions about people's childhoods. Iris tracked the volunteer down to a community center where he taught an innocuous class about carpentry. He greeted her with a smile and hands that smelled of wood, the kind of apology that tastes of polishing oil and Sunday errands. Iris listened and watched. He moved through the room as if he owned its silence, claiming presence with work and small attentions. She learned his name, which fit the letters in the ledger, and watched as he left the center in a parked van whose license plate matched the van in the footage. Now she had more than a note. She had a face and a vehicle trace. She thought about going to the police, about the paperwork, and the nerves of making a formal complaint, supported by shaky inference. But she also pondered the cost of being wrong, humiliation, the strain on the clinic's reputation, the way allegations ripple outward and break things even when they are true. Her hesitation roared then like a beast, trying to protect her from the sharp teeth of consequence. That night she made a different decision, to confront quietly, to speak at a bench in the park where the man walked his coffee thermos like a ritual. She asked simple questions about the volunteer program and watched for small slips. The man smiled and deflected, and Iris felt a tightness that tasted like victory. He left, and she took down his features in the notebook she carried in her bag like a talisman. Later that evening she received a message, a single photo of her standing by the park bench, taken at a distance, time-stamped with the time she had not told anyone she would be there. The photo had been placed on her windshield with no contact information. The note that had been 3 words had learned to speak with a new vocabulary: presence, proof, and an exam of her limits. Iris realized the predator wanted to prove capacity. He wanted to show that he could come into her life not with violence first, but with the patient accrual of evidence that she was always being seen. She pressed her palm to the cold glass of her car and felt the pulse of a choice to move the next piece. She would not play by rules that assumed a single confrontation would fix everything. She would change the pattern by making herself unpredictable, by using her own knowledge of empathy as camouflage that revealed nothing. In that strategy she found a dangerous courage. Not the heroism of dramatic acts, but the steady, insistent courage of people who survive by measuring storms. The game the man had started was this: he would let her find proof and then place a new shadow where she thought she had light. He would teach her that certainty is a fragile thing. Iris reacted by hiding her tracks. She changed her routine, left through different exits, told a harmless lie or two about appointments she never had. She created signals to confuse the watcher. A hat left at a cafe that she did not wear. A book placed on a subway seat with her name written inside and then left behind like a breadcrumb. Small theatrical acts, but the point was to make herself an unreadable page. At the same time, she reached into the clinic files for the cases that had taught her about obsession and control. Patients came in with ordinary resentments that bloomed into stalking. She had read about escalation patterns until the terminology lived under her skin. She began to feel less like a victim and more like an investigator whose own emotions were fuel rather than liability. Yet there were moments where fear returned like muscle memory, waking with a start at 3 a.m, imagining footsteps that were not there, checking the door, and finding nothing but the perfect ordinary of the apartment. Then one night, Mara called with news that made her breath stop. The man, the volunteer carpenter, had been seen at a retirement dinner 2 blocks from Iris's childhood home, an area she avoided now because of memories that smelled of lemon oil and tenderness. He had been chatting with people about old carpentry techniques and had lingered near a woman whose laugh sounded like a bell. Mara said the man's van had been parked around the corner for hours. Iris felt an animal alertness that bypassed thought. He was escalating by proximity, not by spectacle. She walked into the night with a purpose she did not know how to meet, to find him and create a boundary he could not cross. The park where she found him smelled of cut grass and cheap cologne. He looked smaller in person, a common trait of people who hide cruelty behind ordinary faces. He smiled with hands that still bore the grain of sawdust. The confrontation she planned in her head was a slow, formal thing. She wanted witnesses, small witnesses who could attest to the man's presence and demeanor. She sat nearby and let the sounds of the bench and the dog walkers compose a harmless soundtrack. The man approached, and they exchanged casual words about the weather and community events. He asked after the clinic in a tone like someone who wanted to be helpful. Iris offered something small but clear, a question about the volunteer ledger and whether he remembered a woman, with a soft smile, who had once thanked volunteers for their help. He replied with a practiced confusion, and she watched his face fail in a way that revealed a map of small duplicities. Then he asked a personal question about where she grew up, and she gave him a false detail on the fly, a household name that would be true in a parallel life. He wrote it down. It was a small victory. She had baited him with a false piece of home, and his need to possess her story revealed itself when he later repeated the made-up detail in a message left on her car. She had proof he was collecting personal facts. But proof had a cost. She had to choose whether to use it in a formal way or to weaponize it in a quieter domestic manner. She opted for both. She told the police the things she had and handed over footage and the ledger entries. Simultaneously, she planted bait that made the man believe he had gleaned secrets about her past. When he tried to escalate, believing he knew how to control the narrative, he walked into a community watch she and Mara had quietly organized, not a dramatic arrest in a public square, but a net built with neighbors who now watched for small details and who would testify to his odd presences. The man's arrogance, built on the assumption of invisibility, started to collapse. He called her once in the dead hour and left a message that was equal parts apology and threat. Iris listened, recorded, and then listened again until the frayed edges of his voice made him seem less monstrous and more pitiful. She felt strange compassion, and then she let the compassion be information, not a shield. She realized that survival was not a single heroic moment, but the accumulation of little acts and the courage to transform fear into practice. Rain in the city sounded like a crowd but gave no comfort, and Iris felt every drop as accusation. She had rehearsed so many scenarios she could slide into them the way a dancer moved through steps. And yet there was an improvisation she had not learned until she needed it, to let anger be a tool and not a blinding lens. The man's arrogance had been his undoing. He had mistaken ordinary kindness for surrender and had begun to treat Iris's life like an open book he could annotate at will. But people who treat lives like drafts forget that manuscripts can be rewritten. With Mara and a small band of neighbors, Iris had changed the narrative from private fear to public vigilance. They shared details and watched shifts in behavior like the weatherman reads clouds. They recorded, they testified, they created a ledger of evidence that made denial harder. The man tried to escalate in a way he thought would be theatrical, a confrontation meant to surprise and shame. He arrived in a market as she left with a bag of oranges, and for a moment the world performed the same small ritual of shopping and sun and ordinary sound. He stepped forward and asked a question about a mutual acquaintance in a tone that was too familiar. Iris answered with a stillness she had earned, and with the small theatrical skill of a person who knows when to let other people make themselves into evidence. Neighbors who had been quietly watching stepped into the light and gave neutral witness to his presence and tone. He grew visibly unmoored, the quiet confidence that sustained him cracking like old paint. In the end, the law did what it could. There were formal steps, a warning, paperwork, and a stipulation that the man stay away. It was not a perfect victory. The system cannot undo the small invasions of years. But there was relief in the fact that her life was no longer a secret theater where he could practice. There were other outcomes, too. Iris found herself changed by the strain. Her empathy had not disappeared, but it had been tempered into a discipline, a way to listen without losing the boundary between self and other. She slept fewer hours, but slept truer, a heavy, honest fatigue that felt like recovery. She returned to the clinic and found her work altered in small ways. She listened for the way people described watching, for the tremor that indicates someone has been followed in the mind as much as in the body. Her clients began to tell stories that felt less lonely because she had been through a version of the same thing and could translate bureaucratic advice into the language of living practical resistance. Some nights Mara and Iris would sit on the stoop and not speak. The silence between them was not empty. It was companionable and filled with the steady small triumph of survival. Iris thought often of the smile that had once saved her life. It had been a thing she used to fold fear into acceptable forms, and now she used it differently, as a marker to remind herself that she would choose warmth, but not at the cost of safety. She taught others to do the same. She told volunteers at the clinic the rules she had discovered: keep records, believe instincts, create shared vigilance. The town changed in modest ways: neighborly patrols, a redirection of deliveries, an informal network of eyes that watched for small acts that had once gone invisible. It was not utopia, but it was life with edges people respected. In the quiet after the man's formal warning, Iris sometimes allowed herself to feel pity for him, pity for the way he had let his need for control become a small ruin. Pity did not excuse the past, but it gave her room not to become the same thing she had opposed. She grew less interested in being strong for the sake of being unbreakable, and more interested in being honest about the fractures that make people whole again. In the last week of rain, she wrote a long email to her colleagues, a careful piece about institutional responses and the importance of small networks. She included attachments and photos and a guide for neighbors. Then she sealed the email and pressed send and felt a small, contained sting of nerves that was good and not debilitating. If this story gripped you, subscribe, share, and comment below. Keep watching because Iris's truth deserves witnesses,